My name is Sharon Schakel, and I'm going to explain the process that I use to make repairs on a vintage quilt. So this is called vintage quilt repair. I have been a seamstress, or I've sewn almost all my life, and since I retired from teaching, I've gotten more into quilting. I belong to a neighborhood group here in Kansas City, in the area, and I've enjoyed learning much more and trying things that I hadn't tried before. I like to do art quilts. I also like to take old quilts and cut out the good parts and make something new out of them. But this is the first time that I have done an actual repair for someone else. And this quilt belongs to a neighbor of mine named Tina, and she grew up in Tennessee, and this quilt was made by her grandmother, her 3 aunts, and her father when he was 5 years old. So we know that the quilt was made about 1952, but I think most of the fabrics were probably from the 40s, because this is a utility quilt and it will be not necessarily made for beauty. It's made for practicality for those cold winter nights in Tennessee. And so this quilt is very interesting. It was fairly well cared for. It was not, this back part is really in pretty good shape. It was, the only place I had to put a patch was right back here.
This is the section that was chewed all the way through. We don't know exactly how that hole got there, but in order to repair it, I just pressed out the existing layers in between and put a piece of flannel in there, tucked it in under that top layer, and then just did a quick basting stitch all the way around so that it'll hold it in place, and then I can add a new piece of fabric over the top in order to stabilize this area.
Here, and I found fabric in the inside of the quilt because there was no batting. Just layers of fabric, and I was able to hand stitch a piece of fabric over there. I laid some flannel, pre-washed flannel in the inside, and then put the patch over the top. And it's a little darker because it was protected in the inside, but it is in the same pink family. So we've got a check, kind of a check plaid, a solid, and then another plaid. And these fabrics were probably fabrics they had on hand. Some of the fabrics look like they might have been sheets. Part of the inside fabric is a chenille bedspread. There's a piece of printed bark cloth, which is a loosely woven fabric. And actually this bark cloth created some problems in the quilt because it wasn't as tightly woven as the other fabrics. Quite a few of the other fabrics were solids, and they were like sheets. They were tightly woven, blues and browns and other colors. And in some places you can see through the fabric because it's fairly thin. You can see what was underneath it. You might see a shadow of a print or a shadow of another color. So we kept as much of the original appearance as we could. But this bark cloth was printed, and I think it might have been used as draperies. I don't think it's heavy enough for upholstery, but I'm not sure. I don't think it was used for clothing, but you can see how frayed it was. And so because the quilt is tied, not quilted, there aren't quilt lines, there are ties, it didn't keep all those layers of fabric completely flat. And so with the daily use and with washing, it eventually let those pieces in the inside get wadded and matted and wrinkled. And so even though it was fairly well cared for, the backside was pretty good. It had not been used as a drop cloth, so it didn't have paint splatters. It hadn't been used by the dog, so there were no hairs. It didn't smell bad. It was in fairly good shape to be worked on. I didn't have to pre-wash or soak or clean at all. So the back was much more preserved than the front. The front was in pretty bad shape. It was quite frayed. It was quite tattered and torn. Parts of it was even shredded. And so the corners especially were pretty bare, and that was how I could see what was underneath and what all those layers of fabric were. And apparently that was fairly common in the 40s and 50s to use that. Maybe batting wasn't available at that time. I'm not sure what the history on that is. But I wanted to be sure before I started on this quilt that it was not a historically important quilt that we should not touch. If it's a quilt that has a historical value, either to Tennessee or to any other part of the country or a certain pattern, then the quilt needs to be just restored, not repaired. But since I had it appraised by my sister, who's an appraiser in Florida, I sent her pictures and she said, no, this is not historically important, but it is important to this family. So you have a little more flexibility in the type of repair work that you want to do. So you can see that it was made in 3 different panels. It was done that way on both sides, front and back. The seams didn't necessarily match up in the same place. They just used the biggest pieces they had, sewed them together, and made a backing and then a top. And I'll show you a clip of when I first started on it and what the front looks like. So I'll come back in a moment.
This quilt is about 1940 era. This side, which I'm assuming is the top side, is quite tattered. A lot of pieces are threadbare, and the edge is really raw and rather damaged. This is another corner where the fabric, the top layer, is completely shredded, torn, and the quilt is tied, not quilted in any kind of pattern. It looks like it's tied with probably embroidery floss. It's not heavy as a yarn. Then there are rips in it, and it shows that the inside layers are made of old clothing, a chenille bedspread, an example of bark cloth there in the middle. Some solid, some plaid, some florals, and it doesn't look like feed sack, so I don't think it's in the 30s. So this will be the quilt that I'm working on to repair. This section is on one side and goes to the edge, and this section shows that the top has really shredded, and so I'm going to try and flatten out. I've pinned the inside layers down so that they'll stay in place, and I won't probably sew all of that in place by hand. I'm thinking that I can, as I'm doing the patching, I'll stitch all of those layers in place and keep them flat. But these strips here, these pieces that have come loose, have to come out. Those cannot remain. My plan now is to keep the pieces of the quilt that are still holding together in place. I don't want to take the whole quilt apart, and I'm just going to repair areas and put patches over the tops where the fabric has shredded.
So this is the top of the quilt, and you saw the clip of when I first looked at it and what condition it was in, so I could evaluate it. I could record what kind of shape the fabric was in, so that I could begin to make a plan for what type of work I would do on it. So the quilt has a little bit different look than it originally did. I wasn't able to keep it looking the same because most of the fabrics were so frayed and shredded that they just had to be cut out. And that was one of the first things I had to do, was cut out all the pieces that were just hanging there, get rid of those, and then start making a plan for what I would do to stabilize the quilt and how I would flatten the insides of the quilt, because it was pretty lumpy. So one of the first things that I did to be able to get into the quilt and flatten it all was I had to cut out the edges. And I cut off about 2 inches of the outer edges because they were so torn and tattered, and it was keeping me from being able to do any work. So once I cut these pieces off, then I could put my hands inside. I could flatten, I could straighten, I could pull out the knobs and the knots and the wadded areas and start to stabilize those. So I could put it on my ironing board, I could iron it with steam, I could use a little bit of thinned out starch type material and get the worst parts, the bulkiest parts, cleaned out and flattened.
This is the edge of the quilt. It shows the striped fabric that was in the top that has really deteriorated. Underneath are several layers. The blue is a piece of cotton, and then under it is a print. And the print is all rumpled and wrinkled, and I don't know if I can get that flattened or not. So the quilt is probably going to stay somewhat lumpy. It's not going to be able to be completely flattened out, but I'll try and get it as flat as I can so that it won't be all lumpy and bumpy when it's repaired. It will have a little smoother effect to it possibly when it's done. But there is also a piece of chenille, probably a bedspread, underneath there, and some of it is wadded up too. So since I'm not taking the whole quilt apart and pulling out all of the red ties, I won't be able to completely smooth all that fabric out. But I can make a pretty good attempt and get it to lay fairly nicely at least.
Now, I wanted the quilt to be fairly even in thickness, and so if I took big pieces out, I had to put something back in order to give it a more unified look. And I did that with pieces of flannel, and of course I had to pre-wash them and dry them so that they would be they would have shrunk to the same amount generally as what the quilt itself. After all these years, it's not going to shrink anymore. But if I put new fabric in there and didn't shrink it, then if it were washed, then the old quilt underneath would get all rumpled and wrinkled, and it wouldn't lay nicely. So that was a little tricky, cleaning out all that in the inside. I tried not to remove any more ties than I had to, because I needed to maintain some kind of structure so that it would stay together while I worked on it. So once I had cut off the edge and flattened the insides, pulled out the knots and so on, and I happened to had a serendipitous event also, because I found in the inside some of the fabrics that were used on the top, on the outside, and I was able to use those for patches. So that was a rather great find. And then when I took a piece out, I could put a piece of flannel or something else in there to smooth that out and keep the thickness fairly close to the same throughout the quilt. The next part, after I flattened it all, was to decide how I could protect the fabric that was left, because it was pretty thin, pretty threadbare, and I wasn't sure what I could do. I had talked to other quilters, and some thought that it wouldn't be good to use just a fusible stabilizer that's used in applique, because it would make the quilt real stiff in areas. So I decided to try the t-shirt fabric that's fusible on one side. It's very soft. It doesn't get stiff and rigid. It doesn't really show once it's in there. So on the areas that were really thin, I knew I had to cover those before I could put actual fabric, the new fabric, on the top. So I'll show a clip of it laying on the floor. When I put these pieces on top, I could just take the iron it flat, and then I knew that those pieces were secure.
This is a corner of the quilt after I've done some work on it, and you can see the original layers of fabric that I uncovered as I looked at the top layer and then tried to repair that section. So the white patches are fabric that's used in t-shirt quilts to stabilize it so it doesn't stretch. This is a very lightweight cotton that has a very light fusible on it. I can lay it over the worst parts of the fabric and then iron over it so that it adheres to the inside layers, and then that will eventually be covered over with the final patches. So you can see some of the areas that were really frayed. The fabric is very fragile. It's torn and shredded in some areas. You can see the blue in that other corner where it has just torn off. It's just gone. And then up above there are other areas that just needed a smaller patch. There are still a few parts where you can see slashes, the dark lines in between, but I'm not going to stabilize that. It will be stabilized with the patch that will go over the top. So I think I'll be using just solid color fabric, probably Kona cotton, that will be washed and dried so that it will be less likely to shrink after it's put on the quilt. Since the quilt is so old, it has shrunk as much as it possibly could. So I got the approval of Tina, the owner, to cut off the edges so that I could start to straighten out as much fabric underneath as possible without actually taking the quilt apart. So you can see all the red ties. It was not done with yarn, it was actually done with, I think, embroidery floss. So that will have to be replaced once I get through with the quilt, get new binding, and get the patches on top. Now in a couple areas, it was real thin, especially this corner now. There aren't as many layers there, so I think I will put a piece of pre-shrunk white flannel underneath that, or on top of that, which will go underneath the final patch that'll be on top. But I'm hoping that the prints underneath will not show through the top fabrics, because it is showing through. You can see the shadows of the underneath fabrics. That bark cloth has a darker brownish print on it, so it's showing through the patches and also through some of the original fabric. But I'm trying to keep as much of the original quilt as possible. I don't want to change it any more than I have to. So the weakest areas will be covered over and then will be quilted and then tied.
Once I had everything stabilized, the next decision was to take the fabrics and how I would lay them out. And I wanted to keep the colors the same, and there was pink on the back, pink in this stripe that looks like sheeting material, pink in the middle, it's kind of pink and orange and yellow, and then pink here. This is a print of pink corn cobs. Very interesting. And I was able to keep most of that fabric, but I had some nice pieces that I could lay over the top and patch with those, so that, and then one small patch here. A few of the smaller patches I could just do by hand, and then they would be sewn down when it was stitched by machine. So since it was not a historically important thing, I knew that I could still use a machine quilting pattern. And my original idea was to do a channel quilting through and between the rows of ties. But as it turned out, once I did a few rows, I realized that the ties weren't exactly even, and my rows were going a little irregular. So after a while, I realized I just had to measure between rows about 3 inches and just run that across the fabric one direction and then across the quilt in another direction, so that any of the fabrics in the inside that are still there that I didn't move or touch, they are quilted every 3 inches, so that it's not going to wad up and fray and get all wrinkled in the inside like it did before when it was just tied. The ties were not enough to really hold some of those heavy fabrics that were loosely woven. It just couldn't hold all the corners. Plus, ties get fragile also, and if ties came loose, then that allowed the fabric in the inside to move even more. So I found I wanted to stay with the pink and the white, and use those, really these to cover the areas that were very, very thin, and it just went over the top. Now in some areas you can see through that. You can see there's a little bit of the stripe underneath here. You can see there's a piece of the pink fabric that they used in the middle, a shadow there. And in one area, the bark cloth pattern shows through, but most of the fabrics were solid, so they only show through, maybe giving the top fabrics then a little bit of a shadow or lighter dark effect. Some places I just ran a piece of flannel underneath in order to protect the old fabric before I put the new fabric on. The new fabric is 100% cotton, because everything in the quilt is 100% cotton. And it's a Kona cotton that I pre-washed, dried, and then pressed so that it could be applied, and if the quilt is ever washed, it will not make the quilt in a strange puckered look. So those I just top stitched in place. I didn't follow a particular pattern, just really blocked out areas that were weak and needed to be covered. So I wanted to keep at least a section or two of every one of the original pieces so that it maintained at least part of the original look. Now, as I worked on it, I realized that these seams of these 3 panels were threadbare, and I had to decide how to preserve those because I couldn't really hand stitch over. I couldn't whip stitch because the thread was so thin, the fabric was so thin, and the stitching of the seams was just pulling apart. So I decided to just make about a 4-inch piece of fabric, a stripe, all the way down, up and down, so that it would cover up those seams, those vulnerable areas. And now the strain and the tension is on the new fabric, not on the old seams underneath. So it's become much more secure. These areas, of course, are still pretty fragile. It should never be machine washed. It can't stand that agitation. But in the event that it needed to be washed, it could be soaked in a bathtub with a quilt soap, and it just kind of squished and moved about and cleaned, rinsed a few times, and then rolled up in towels until it would get fairly dry. And then the best thing to do would be to lay it flat to dry. It should not be put in a dryer. These old quilts just can't take our modern methods of cleaning. Once I got all the quilting done, all the quilt lines, then it was time to square up the quilt, and I had to put on a new binding. And today we use a separate binding, 2 1/4 inch wide fabric, and Tina and I decided that we liked the pink the best. The pink worked with the back, and it was a nice finish for the top also. So I found this pink fabric, again 100% cotton, and folded it in half, pressed it, then stitched it down by machine on one side, flipped it under, and sewed it by hand on the back side. So the edges now are pretty stable. They're pretty tight. The edges tend to take the most wear, but it's double thickness. It's stitched to the strongest part. I did have to trim in a few places because the fabric on the edges was so thin and so frayed. So I had to trim it a little bit so that I could get a good grip when I put the binding on. So once the binding was done and it was all neat and tidy and a nice squared quilt, it was starting to look pretty good. I thought, wow, this is really amazing. It was time then to add the authentic look of the red ties. I tried to leave as many of them as I could. Some of them were loose. I tried to tie them back together. But I found that when I covered over the old areas, even though I left the original ties there, I couldn't pull them through to the new fabric. So I had to put a lot of new ties. And usually in that era, it was yarn that was used, or at least quilts that I've seen, they usually used yarn, tied it with a square knot. And when I looked closer at the older ties, I realized it was embroidery floss. And I didn't really want to use embroidery floss, but I found this real crochet thread that is about the thickness, and I just doubled it to give the same appearance as the original. And now, because it is cotton, I was concerned about it bleeding. So I put it in a container, a bowl of hot water overnight, and I got up in the morning and thought, wow, this did not bleed. This is really good. So I took it out of the bowl, set it on paper towels, and then it bled. But it was not a terrible bleed, but there was some. So, but there's not much else that we can do really with the cottons unless they've been washed again and again and again. So I washed it, I let it dry, and it should be more color fast than it was. Another problem I ran into as I was working on the ties is that the needle that I had to use is fairly thick, and the quilt itself is fairly thick, and thicker in some spots than others. Plus, where there are seams and so on, it was a little harder to get those through. So I went to my sewing machine area and found my rubber fingertips, and these were lifesavers. I was able to push the needle into the the quilt and come back up in one stroke, about a quarter to a half an inch, and then make a square knot and tie it off. So these were lifesavers for pushing that needle through the quilt. It was a little tougher than I expected, and I spent many nights watching television and tying ties. It was interesting. As I tied them, I just used my finger as a gauge, held it in my finger, and then cut it off above my finger. They're not all consistently the same length, but they're close, and it gives that vintage look still. So I was able to keep some of the original look on the top, not as much as on the backing, of course, because that didn't need much work. It was in pretty good shape. And here I've tried to keep the vintage look as much as possible, but stabilizing it, securing it, and making it sturdy enough for Tina and her family to use this for many more years.